This video is going to be our last video in the stained glass series. This one is going to teach you how to solder. So some things that you're going to need for this. You are going to need a little wooden board or kind of a cork board to adhere your pieces to or to do your soldering on. You are going to need some thumbtacks. You are going to need a soldering iron. This one is just from Amazon. And then my irons came with this little rest. There is a sponge in there. That sponge is wet, and it'll be a spot where I can kind of cool off or clean off the end. I'm also going to need some flux and a brush. I am using Ruby Fluid soldering paste. And then finally, I am going to need solder. This is a 50-50 solder, but in the unit where I'm going to be teaching this, we're going to be using a 60-40, so 60 aluminum, 40 lead. It also doesn't hurt to have some good ventilation. I have a vent on over the top of me because you are soldering with lead. You're going to want to wash your hands when you're done, and you're not going to want to inhale a crazy amount of these fumes. All right, the first thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to turn my soldering iron on while I'm getting my piece pinned down. And I've read a lot of conflicting information about how hot your soldering iron can be or should be, but I guess a good test of it is if you take a piece of solder and you push it like this, and you can see that little liquid bead forming, that's hot enough. If I can't do that, it's not hot enough. This one is very hot. I definitely don't want to touch any part of this with my hand. So there's some safety things if you're doing this in a group scenario. Make sure the people around you know that you're using a soldering iron as well. Now I like to tack my pieces down with actual tacks. I like to use these thumbtacks that have the little ledge on them. I think those work the best. This board is really nice and soft, and it allows me just to kind of pin these in place because sometimes as you're soldering, they can move. I've pinned each of my pieces in 2 places so that it is not gonna move. And the way that I like to set this up, so I'll have my flux in one area, and I will have my brush, and then I'll probably keep my solder over here. And just the way my cords, I would like to keep this on my right side because I'm right-handed, but just the way that my outlet works, I have to kind of keep it over here. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm going to take my flux and I'm going to take it and paint it on all of the pieces. I'm gonna take it and paint it along all of the copper striping or stripping. Now I only have one seam that needs to be sewn or that needs to be soldered together. This one up on top, I'm gonna need to solder there, there, and there. I am gonna solder the outside edge, but right now we're just focusing on getting the 2 pieces stuck together. So I just put some solder along here. This is where you're gonna find where if you have a really big gap, you're gonna run into some issues. And then I'm gonna take my soldering iron in my right hand and my solder itself in my left hand. I like to pull out a little bit of a tail like this so that I'm not at risk of touching my skin with the soldering iron. I'm going to set this to it, and I'm gonna start by tacking each of my pieces together. And you're gonna find sometimes with your soldering iron, it's gonna get some kind of cool spots, or it might take a second for it to heat up. Okay. And tacking is just putting a small little, it's called a bead of solder, along the strips that need to stay connected. If I had multiple pieces, I would be tacking each of those pieces so that if it moves at all, they would stay together. So tacking is the first step. This one was super easy. My second step is what's called tinning. So you can pick up some solder, maybe from the side, or you can have some out in front. And tinning is basically just painting with the solder. And I'm pretty out of practice. It's been a long time since I've done this, so it might take me a minute. And I'm gonna take this and just paint this along the edge. So I wanna get myself a good amount of solder built up along the seam. Now, once I have that tinned, I'm going to do what's called a bead. And a bead essentially is like a U-shaped, you want there to be kind of an elevated, if I were to look at it from the side, like a rounded bead, for lack of a better term, or line of solder. So I'm going to use some more solder. This tip is taking kind of a long time to like heat up the solder. Sometimes you have to clean it. Sometimes they develop, I've noticed, like they develop like cool and hot spots. So I like to make sure there's nothing random on there. Obviously I'm not going to touch it, but now I'm going to take this here and I'm going to touch this to it. Hopefully it starts to melt right away, and I'm going to build up some solder on here. I'm going to move as I go. Okay, and I am not that good at this, so if somebody is like a professional stained glass artist watching this, they're probably going to laugh at me. If you look at this bead from the side, it is pretty atrocious. It's very uneven. It looks kind of spotty. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna take my soldering iron and I'm gonna heat, and I like to go at it from one side and I like to kind of tap it down. I can tell I have a lot of solder up here and not a lot of solder down here. If you have too much solder, it's gonna start to clump and it's not gonna look good. So there's definitely an art to getting the right amount of solder. But if you have a bead that looks really messy or really uneven, you can continue to play with it. Like that looks really good right there, and this looks a little rough. So I'm gonna continue to build up this side. Other safety note is that if I were to touch the solder right now, or sometimes even touch the copper foil near it, like right here, it's warm. The heat travels through the glass, so that's just another safety thing you wanna be cautious of. So the next thing I'm gonna do here, now that I have those two edges together, I am gonna have to flip this over and do the same thing to the other side, but before I do that, I'm gonna paint some flux around my outside edges. Now, it's important that this flux is painted on, otherwise your solder is not going to adhere. I need to cover up all this copper foil with flux. All right, so now you can see, obviously I've got some work to do on the sides. I'm gonna flip it over and solder the other side, but you can see what I mean by that bead, how it is rounded, and I don't wanna touch it, I just did it, but how it stands out from the glass. It creates a little dome over the top of it. Now, I have completely and totally botched the side. I don't know if you can see all those little beads of solder, and I need to cover that all up. So I just found two things. I don't want to touch my glass. I found two things to prop it up next to. I don't know if this is going to work or not, just two glass jars. But I'm going to go through, and first I'm going to make sure that I've got flux everywhere. If I don't have flux, it's not going to stick. And then again, I'm going to just touch this and beat it up. I think the sides are the trickiest part because you're gonna notice, like you're gonna get a little, see how that little bit just kind of like fell off? Some of it's gonna fall off and some of it is gonna, oh, that's not working. Maybe I have to hold from this side. It's not hot, I don't know. And see how like that extra falls off? It's not gonna go anywhere where there is not already flux. It's also not gonna stick to the glass. It's only gonna stick to the copper. So if a little bit got on the glass to start, you'll be able to get it off. So I'm gonna just take my time, run this along the edge. See how that got me like a nice even seam? I'm gonna do that all the way around. All right, now I have a piece that is soldered through the middle, and my sides and my edges are all soldered. If I wanted to put a little hook on it, I would take some wire, I would wrap the wire in the copper foil, and I would solder that right here. I'm not going to show you that, but you can kind of troubleshoot how you would do that. But you want there to be a nice built-up line of solder all the way around. All this black gunk on the edges is just what happens when the flux gets heated up. That will come off if you just rinse it off. And the nice thing about soldering is if you have a spot where you're really unhappy with how it looks, you can always touch a hot soldering iron to it, reheat it, and build the bead back up again. Have fun!